Ed Sheeran's looping is world famous and world class. And today I'm going to show you how to set it up in Ableton using only stock plugins. You also need a foot pedal. So let's go. What exactly do you need? Let's get into specifics. You need a version of Ableton Live with the looper plugin. So not a light version you sometimes get free with hardware. One of the 3 paid options. Intro, standard or suite. You need a MIDI foot pedal with at least 6 pedals. There are a few versions you can get. The one I use is this one, the FCB 1010 by Behringer. And then of course you also need instruments, 2 microphones, 1 acoustic guitar, 1 MIDI keyboard. This can be a small one or a large one. Doesn't really matter. And that is it. You might have heard that Ed uses software called Mobius to control his loops, but you don't need that in this process. Don't forget he's also got an army of sound engineers mixing his set as he plays live. You don't need them either. My process isn't 100% the same as Ed's, and I've got a few workarounds, but by the end of this video, I think you'll be fired up to give this process a try. How does Ed's amazing Chewy 2 pedal work? So this is a picture of Ed's Chewy 2 pedal. This is the master control of everything he does live on stage. There are 4 looper channels, which are controlled by these 4 looper buttons. Guitar, which takes an input from his acoustic guitar, and he plays chords and notes on this one. Boom, which also takes an input from his acoustic guitar, but he uses this one to make percussive or rhythmic sounds like tapping his guitar. RC20 is the 3rd channel. This is named after his first loop pedal, the Boss RC20. This is now a discontinued pedal, but was used extensively by Ed at the start of his career. This has inputs from the keyboard, guitar, and microphone, so everything gets recorded onto this track, which is a bit like what the RC20 used to be like. And the final track is called Vox. This has an input from the microphone. He records vocal lines, harmonies, and beatbox on this channel. There are a bunch of other buttons on the Chewy 2. Record play, stop, clear, undo. They all do pretty obvious stuff, very similar to what you would see on a normal loop pedal. There are 2 key points I want to make about this loop pedal. 1, think of this pedal as a single looper with 4 channels. What do I mean by this? In Ed's songs, he doesn't have different loop lengths. They are all the same length. For example, in Castle on the Hill, all of his loops that are recorded on that song last for 4 bars. So in a way, the pedal controls 1 master looper, but you have 4 independent channels that you can record to and play independently. It's a subtle thing, but it means we're able to drastically simplify how we set up the pedal in Ableton. And the second key point is this button here called Mode. This button shifts the pedal between 2 modes, record and playback. Record mode is where you literally record or overdub the loops. You capture the loops on whichever channel you have selected using these buttons here. Playback mode is where the looper is no longer recording loops. You are now focusing on playing the loops. In this mode, Ed starts or stops the loops using these 4 buttons here. So you can have any combination of all 4 playing. So remember these 2 points. We'll be back to use these in our Ableton build very soon. So without further ado, let's fire up Ableton, smash that like button, and get building Ed Sheeran's Chewy 2 pedal. Overall steps in the process. So let's do a quick overview of the process. There are timestamps in the video, so you can jump ahead, but I would recommend watching the whole video because then you'll understand the complete build and it will make it much easier for you. Firstly, we'll set up the global settings within Ableton, but then we'll spend a little bit of time setting up the Ableton tracks and loopers. Then we'll set up the pedal board, map the record mode, map the playback mode, and then finally test it to make sure it all works. I'll show you the process in Ableton so you can see how it works, and I'll make sure I tell you why we're doing things, because this will help you to learn Ableton, but it might also give you ideas that you can use in your own setup. So the first setting to talk about is global quantize. So here we are in Ableton. As a recap, global quantize is a setting that allows you to control how and when clips and other effects are triggered within Ableton. Normally this is set to 1 bar, as you can see here. This means that the clip will be triggered at the start of the next bar after you pressed it. So if you hit the button on beat 2 or beat 3 of a bar, the trigger will actually happen on beat 1 of the next bar. This is really helpful because you don't have to be exact with your timing, and Ableton will keep your loops perfectly aligned. This is what we want with this pedal, because we want the loops to line up with the tempo grid. If you had this set to none and you started and stopped the loopers, they would be out of time with each other. It would sound terrible. So we set global quantize to 1 bar. However, it's worth noting that we will have a different setting for this particular function in one of our loopers later. Intriguing. The other setting that's important to get right is to do with the arm buttons, and you can find it in the preferences. So let's go there. So here are the preferences. Can you see this? Exclusive. You can turn arm off or on. You want this to be on. This means that only one of your tracks can be armed at any one time, as you can see here. I'll explain why in a bit. And these are the only global settings that you need to get right. Easy peasy. So let's get all our tracks set up. There are 3 types of track. Number 1, input tracks, where your microphones and instruments feed into. Number 2, looper tracks. These mimic the 4 channels on the Chewy 2. And number 3, send tracks. Well, there's actually only one send track that you use in this setup, and I'll show you that in a second. So you can see here that we've got the input tracks on the right-hand side. We've got the loopers on the left-hand side, which is from guitar, boom, RC20 Vox, and master looper. They're the looper tracks. And we've got the send track called performance over here. And this is going to be used as the main output from Ableton for everything. So the only setting you really need to change here is to make sure that your audio 2 is going to the right place. So for me, that's master, but you might have this going to a particular external output if you wanted to route it somewhere else. But master's probably fine if you're not sure. There are 4 input tracks you need to set up. The first audio track is for the main vocal. This is what you'll sing through, and it's not going to be looped. I would use the best microphone that you have. So the one I'm talking into now is actually the one that I use for my main vocal. Set the input to this first track here. So I've got my mic coming into track number 1 and rename the track to main vocal. The second track here is for your second microphone. You'll know that Ed obviously uses 2 microphones, and this second mic is the one that we use for looping. So again, this is coming in from my input number 3. A third audio track for your acoustic guitar. I've named this guitar in and set it to the right input. And then finally, you've got your MIDI keyboard. You can see over here, this is set to MIDI channel 1 and feeds in here like this. And they're the 4 tracks that you need to set up for your input. Now, for each of these input tracks, you need to make sure they're set up with the following settings. Number 1, set monitor to in. This is important because we want to hear the instruments at all times. If you select auto, you only hear the instruments when the track is record armed, which we don't want. Audio output for each of these tracks will be explained in a second. You need to make sure that all 4 of these tracks are sending 100% of their signal into the send track. So in simple terms, whenever you play guitar, sing, or play the keyboard, it will all route into the performance send track, and your audience will be able to hear it at all times. And that's what you want. Now we move on to the critical part of the setup, the looper tracks. These are audio tracks that will each hold an instance of the looper effect within Ableton. Earlier, I described the 4 buttons on Ed's Chewy 2 pedal. We will set 1 Ableton track up for each of these tracks. And we will also set up a master looper track. This will also house an instance of the looper effect, and we will use this as a control device for the other loopers. So let's make sure these are set up right. So for guitar track, audio from should be guitar in. So that's literally coming from the guitar in. Everything that's coming through here is going into audio. For boom, we do the same. We need to make sure that it's guitar in. So these 2 tracks, remember, are coming from the guitar. We're playing guitar chords and notes on here and percussive things on boom. For the RC20, we can actually set this to no input, because actually what we want is we'll take this is the track, remember I said earlier, where all the instruments feed into. So actually, rather than putting an input in here, what I do is I actually feed from all of these tracks at the bottom, from second mic, guitar in, and keys in. They all feed to RC20. So that's where they go. And Vox finally has audio from second mic. And those settings there will literally mean that you're set up perfectly to record and loop within this Ableton Chewy 2 setup. Monitor settings for each of these 4 looper tracks should be set to auto. Remember, only one of these tracks can be armed at any one point. So when we choose auto and arm the track, that actually feeds the audio into the looper. So when the track is not armed, no audio is feeding into the looper, and that's how we control which looper is recorded to. The outputs should be set to send only, and the send level should be set to 100%, as similar to the input tracks. So again, all of these tracks will feed into the performance send, and that's what your audience will hear. The exception to these is this master looper track. This has 0 send level and monitor set to none. You'll notice that I keep my inputs, my loopers, and my outputs separate. This gives you the greatest flexibility that you can have. Now it's time to add some loopers. I've got a few videos on my channel that talk through the exact settings of the Ableton looper effect, so I won't spend ages talking about them here. So in each of your 5 looper tracks, each of them should have 1 instance of the looper effect like this. Now first, let's sort out the master looper effect. Remember I said earlier, this is the one that controls all the other loopers. Let's do those settings now. Firstly, so choose the quantize setting down here to be none. This is important because this looper we're going to use to control Ableton, so we want it to react in real time. Next, we choose the song start settings. Here, we want to choose start and stop song. This means that when you hit this transport button, or play, or stop, it will literally start or stop Ableton from within this looper. It's quite a nice function and powerful to have it on its own looper here. Tempo settings should be set and follow song tempo, because we want this looper to set how fast or slow the song will play based upon the first loop that we play. And this is the part of the Ableton setup that makes that happen. We aren't actually going to record any audio in this looper. We're just going to use it to control the other loopers. We're going to map the big transport button for this looper and all the other loopers on the other 4 tracks to one pedal on my pedal board. So this means when we start the loopers using that particular button on my pedal board, all 4 loopers start recording at the same time, but they're independent from each other. So that when we're capturing loops, all 4 loopers start together, but they're kept separate and independent, and we can do things with them separately later when we want to play them or stop them. For the other 4 loopers, here are the settings that you need. We've already set up the global quantization earlier, so you can leave quantize here to global. This means it will be 1 bar. So obviously when you press play or stop on this, it will wait to the beginning of the next bar to start or stop the looper. Song control should be none. Remember, we set the master looper in this track over here to control the song. We don't want the other loopers doing that too. Otherwise, if these could control the song, when you wanted to stop that loop, it would actually stop the song playing. We don't want that. We want the song to keep going. And in terms of tempo control, put these to set and follow song tempo, similar to the master looper. The final setting to talk about is inputs to output being never. What that basically means is you can't hear the audio coming through the track while it's recording or before it's recording. The only time you hear audio is when the looper is playing the audio that's recorded. And that's important because it means you don't double up the sound. You don't have like 2 guitars playing. You can watch a video up here where I explain it a bit more fully. So if you followed these steps on setting up your input tracks and the loopers, you're now completely set up with an Ableton Live. The only thing you need to do now is set up your foot pedal and map it to certain buttons with an Ableton Live. So my beast of choice isn't Chewy 2. It's this wonderful pedal, FCB 1010. I bloody love this pedal. There's an affiliate link in the video description if you're looking to buy this pedal, and that would obviously help support the channel if you did so. So thanks. If you don't go for the FCB 1010, the main thing you need to make sure you can do is have buttons that are programmable. You need to be able to change what these buttons are doing from a MIDI perspective, and your pedal needs to be able to send MIDI notes and MIDI CC messages. Now let's take a slightly closer look at the FCB 1010 and the global settings you need for your pedal. So now we're going to set up the FCB 1010. You can see my pedal here. Make sure you use a different MIDI channel for this pedal than the keyboard that you're using. My keyboard, for example, is on channel 1. My FCB here is on channel 3. This avoids the keyboard triggering the loopers or the pedal playing the keyboard. The FCB has a bank system that you can toggle through like this. You can have up to 10 banks of these 10 pedals, which means up to 100 programmable pedals, which is pretty amazing. You can see which bank you're on by the red numbers at the top of the pedal. So here I've moved off to bank 2. Remember earlier I told you there were 2 modes, record mode and then playback mode. For my system I use different banks to emulate these modes. So bank 2 here is record mode. Bank 3 here is playback mode. And as a final point, I'm not using these expression pedals over here. Ed doesn't have expression pedals on his Chewy 2, so let's ignore them for now. So on to the next phase, mapping the buttons for record mode onto the FCB 1010. Take a look at my FCB 1010. I use buttons 1, 2, 3, and 4 for the 4 tracks on Ed's pedal board here. This keeps it nice and easy to remember which track they're controlling. I will use button 5 for record and play, button 10 for stop, and finally I'll use button 6 for clear and button 7 for undo. The mode button is not mapped. As I explained earlier, I'm using 2 banks within my FCB 1010 to control which mode I'm in, so we can press these buttons to go up and down the banks to move between the modes. Now let's get mapping. Remember I said earlier that the Chewy 2 is like one master looper with 4 channels, but that all the loops were the same length in any given song. This is where we can use this to simplify the setup. Rather than having separate controls for each of the loopers, which would mean you need way more than 10 buttons, we're going to make the loopers act in unison. This means they are all recording at the same time and all playing back at the same time. So what this means in practice is that we need to map all 5 of the transport buttons on each of the looper effects to one button on my pedal board. And this is the same for all of the undo buttons mapped to one button and all of the clear buttons mapped to one button. To control which looper is recording, we use these arm buttons here. So only when this button is armed can the audio from the input feed into the looper. So you only capture audio on the track that has the record arm. So in practice, this means that all 4 loopers are actually recording audio, but only one of them is actually having the input feeding into it. So that works really well. Button 5 on my looper board, as I said earlier, will be mapped to each of the big transport buttons here that you can see. These looper buttons require momentary MIDI messages, which I'm going to use MIDI notes to do. Button 5 on my pedal board sends the note B5 into Ableton. And if I open up my MIDI mapping mode here, you can see that B5 here is mapped to each of the pedal or transport buttons on the looper. Button C6 is mapped to clear, and this is coming from my pedal board button 6, and then pedal board button 7 is set to C#6, and that is the undo button that you can see, and they're all mapped That one button is mapped to all of the undos, all of the clears, and all of the transport buttons. And finally, button 10 is set to MIDI note D7. And this has been mapped to the main transport stop button right at the top here. This means if I want to just stop the song, I can press button 10. The final bit of mapping is these 4 buttons on the Chewy pedal board. These are the buttons which Ed presses to tell the looper which channel he wants to record audio on. Guitar, boom, RC20 or Vox. For this, we're going to use the record arm button here. Now, to effectively map these record arm buttons, you need a MIDI toggle message. It's different to a MIDI momentary message, and a MIDI note won't do the business. So you need to use MIDI CC to do a toggle message. Think of a toggle message like an old-fashioned stomp box. Press it once to turn it on, press it again to turn it off. So each time you press it, it goes on, off, like that. So I will set these 4 buttons to send different MIDI CC messages that act as a toggle button. So I use MIDI CC 91, 92, 93, and 94 to map to the record arms of the 4 looper tracks, respectively. Probably worth testing out as well. So I'm now pressing my buttons on the floor here. And you can see as I press button 1, it changes to 1, 2, 3, and 4. So now it's time to map the playback mode. So I'm going to press bank up, which will take me to bank 3, and that's where I will now map the playback mode on my FCB 1010. Now for playback mode, we need to be able to start and stop these 4 loopers independently. This is the main way that Ed manages his loops during his live performance. And it's nice and easy, as all the functions we need in playback mode need momentary messages, so MIDI notes. We're going to use buttons 1, 2, 3, and 4 to play the loopers, and buttons 6, 7, 8, and 9 to stop the loopers. So button 1 will start looper 1, and button 6 will stop looper 1. Button 2 will start looper 2, button 7 will stop looper 2, if that makes sense. So these all need to be different MIDI notes. And if you map each of those to the start and stop buttons as I've described, you'll be able to control which of those loopers is playing at any one time during your performance. Ed often stops and starts his songs mid-performance. So to do this, we're going to map button 5 on our pedal board to the play button up here, and button 10 we're going to map to the stop button up here. So you're literally able to start and stop the track at any point during playback. What this does is when you press stop, and then when you press play, it always starts all 4 loopers from the beginning of their loop. And that's quite powerful because you're able to emphasize certain words by pressing stop, and as you sing them, and then you can come back another loop nice and tight. So it works really well. You may have noticed that Ed only has 1 button per track, and in my system, I've got 2 buttons in my playback mode. So Ed presses that button once for on and once for off, whereas I have 2 buttons to manage. This isn't ideal, but I simply couldn't think of a way of doing this in Ableton without utilizing those pedals as I have. Can you let me know in the comments if you can think of a way around this? I'd love to make this only be on 1 button, but really struggling to get my head around how to do that. So as I say, not quite as good as Ed's setup, but perfectly usable and works really well. Now you've done this, let's get on to the fun bit. Let's test out this with a song. To start a song, you need to be on bank 2, which you can see here. You also need to be at the beginning of the Ableton track 1.1.1, and we're not there now, as you can see. This is important because all the tracks need to start on beat 1 when you first record, otherwise some strange things happen. So I press button 10 on my looper board here, button 10, which then is the stop button, remember, and that will take me back to the beginning. It's also a good idea to clear all of your loopers. So button 6, remember, is the clear button. So that means there are no pre-recorded loops there. So I cleared that one that you could see. And now we're basically ready to go. So I need to choose which track I'd like to record on. So remember, the arm button is set by these 4 buttons here. So if I press 1, I move us onto track 1. So that means this is the only looper. Despite them all recording, this is the only one that will capture audio. Let's do this song. Great. Press number 2. The next thing I'm going to do is some beats. Let's go. All good. I think I've got that. The next thing is I'm going to record on the 3rd track some high guitar parts. Let's go. Now, while I'm getting ready to do the vocals, I'm going to press button 3 again, and that will turn off the record arm. That's sounding pretty good. The next thing I want to do is the harmony part. So, and then I'll press record arm 4, and I'll start singing them. Let's go. Na 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 now. Na 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 na. here, that's quite loud actually. So now I need to press button 5 here, record play, and that turns all the loopers onto playback mode. I'm going to go up a bank, which is my bank 3, which is the playback mode. And this is where I can turn on or off all of these loopers. So I press 7, 8 and 9, and at the beginning of the next bar I'm left with just track 1, which is 1 and 6. So remember, track 1 starts with 1 and stops with 6. If I wanted to add drums, which is track 2, press that before the beginning of the bar. If I wanted to add in guitar, press that before the beginning of the bar. And that's it really. The other thing, remember I said, is you can do stop and start. And this is quite nice, so you can do something like this. Met this girl late last year, she said don't you worry if I disappear. She told me I'm not really looking for another romance. I told my old friend thinking that the trouble would wait. When I turned right in a week later it burned. I reckon she was only looking for a lover to burn. But I gave her my time for 2 or 3 nights, and I put it on pause until the moment was right. So you can see that, right? Ed just does that quite a lot in his songs to emphasise the lyrics. So that is the entire pedal board. It's working quite well. I'm quite pleased with that. And that's it. If you've followed this tutorial all the way through, you've now got a fully functioning Chewy 2 pedal built in Ableton using only a MIDI foot pedal and stock plugins. So now you've got this, the next thing you need is a sound guy, a stadium rig, and about 50,000 fans to sing to. If you watch this video, you won't get any of that, but you will get 10 tips on how to loop like a boss, which will be really helpful to use with your new Chewy 2 pedal.